The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Lady Margaret Ashford adjusted her riding gloves with trembling fingers. At 23, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words and women whisper behind their fans. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her green eyes held a fire that had gotten her into trouble more times than she cared to count. Today would be no different. Margaret had received the letter 3 days prior, written in her younger brother's shaky handwriting from debtor's prison. Thomas owed a substantial sum to the crown, money he had gambled away in a moment of foolish desperation. The royal guards had come for him in the dead of night, dragging him from his bed while his wife screamed and their children wept. Now he sat in a cold cell, awaiting a trial that would surely end in his execution. The Ashford family had once been wealthy landowners, but years of poor harvests and her father's drinking had left them with nothing but their name and a crumbling manor house. Margaret had sold everything of value, from her mother's jewelry to the family silver, but it still wasn't enough to pay Thomas's debt. She had one last option, one that required her to swallow her pride and beg. She was here to see Captain James Whitmore, the head of the Royal Guard. Margaret had known James since childhood. Their families' estates had bordered each other, and they had played together as children before the rigid lines of social class had separated them. James had joined the Royal Guard at 16, working his way up through the ranks with determination and skill that impressed even his harshest critics. Now, at 30, he commanded respect from both his men and the nobility who sought audience with the king. He was also devastatingly handsome, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and blue eyes that seemed to see everything. Margaret had harbored feelings for him once, long ago, before life had taught her that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. As she approached the guard station, Margaret saw James reviewing documents with 2 of his subordinates. He wore the red and gold uniform of the Royal Guard with pride, his posture straight and commanding. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his expression shifted from professional courtesy to something she couldn't quite read. "Lady Margaret," he said, standing and bowing slightly. "Captain Whitmore," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I need to speak with you privately." James dismissed his men with a nod and gestured for Margaret to follow him to a small office adjacent to the main guard quarters. The room was sparse but clean, with maps of the castle grounds covering one wall and a desk stacked with reports and correspondence. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her, his expression guarded. "What brings you to the castle, Margaret?" She had rehearsed this speech a dozen times, but now that she stood before him, the words seemed to stick in her throat. "It's about Thomas," she said finally. "My brother." James's face darkened. "I know about your brother's situation. The debt to the crown is substantial, and the evidence of his gambling is overwhelming." "He made a mistake," Margaret said, stepping closer. "A terrible mistake. But he doesn't deserve to die for it. His children don't deserve to lose their father. The law is clear," James replied, though his tone had softened slightly. "Those who steal from the crown face execution. I don't make the rules, Margaret. I simply enforce them." Margaret felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She had pinned all her hopes on James's childhood affection for her, on the possibility that he might show mercy for old time's sake. But the man standing before her was not the boy she had once known. This was Captain Whitmore, loyal servant of the crown, and he would not bend the rules even for her. "Please," she whispered, and the word tasted like ash in her mouth. "I'm begging you." James turned away from her, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out the small window. "Even if I wanted to help, which I do, there's nothing I can do. The order comes from the king himself." Something inside Margaret snapped. All the fear, all the desperation, all the helpless rage she had been carrying for days suddenly erupted. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, she grabbed the first thing her hand found on his desk, a heavy brass paperweight shaped like a lion, and hurled it at him with all her strength. The paperweight struck James in the shoulder, spinning him around. His eyes went wide with shock, not at the impact, but at what she had done. Attacking a royal guard was treason, punishable by death. In her desperate fury, Margaret had just signed her own execution warrant. The door burst open as 2 guards rushed in. Having heard the commotion, they drew their swords, pointing them at Margaret's throat as she stood frozen, suddenly realizing the magnitude of her actions. "Stand down," James barked at his men, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The guards hesitated, looking between their captain and the woman who had just committed an act of treason before their very eyes. "But sir," one of them stammered, "she attacked you." "We witnessed it." James rubbed his shoulder where the paperweight had struck him, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. She could see him calculating, weighing his options. The law was clear: she had assaulted a royal guard in full view of witnesses. By rights, she should be arrested immediately and taken to the same prison that held her brother. "You saw nothing," James said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "Sir, I said you saw nothing," James repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Lady Margaret came to discuss a private matter, and now she is leaving. That is what happened here today." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. He was protecting her, risking his own position to save her from the consequences of her rash actions. But why? What did he hope to gain? One of the guards opened his mouth to protest, but James silenced him with a look that could have melted steel. "Return to your posts," he commanded. "Now." The guards sheathed their weapons reluctantly and filed out of the room, leaving Margaret and James alone once more. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. "Why?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James picked up the brass paperweight from where it had fallen, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. "Because," he said slowly, "sometimes mercy is more important than the law." He set the paperweight back on his desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the courtyard where other guards went about their duties, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. "I can't save your brother," he said without turning around. "The king's decision is final, and to challenge it would mean my own death. But I won't be the one to send you to join him." Margaret felt tears burning her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and despair that threatened to overwhelm her. "I don't understand. After what I just did." "What you just did was the act of a desperate woman trying to save her family," James said, finally turning to face her. "I've seen real criminals, Margaret. Men who steal and kill without remorse. Your brother may have made a terrible mistake, but he's not evil. And neither are you." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, offering a comfort she hadn't expected to find. But it also brought a crushing realization: if James, with all his influence and position, couldn't save Thomas, then no one could. "What happens now?" she asked. James moved to his desk and pulled out a piece of parchment, dipping his quill in ink. "Now you go home," he said as he began to write. "You forget this day ever happened, and you prepare yourself for what's to come." He finished writing and held the letter out to her. "This is a safe passage document. It will ensure you face no trouble on your journey home." Margaret took the letter with hands that shook slightly. "And, Thomas," James's expression grew somber, "your brother's trial is set for next week." "I'm sorry, Margaret, I truly am." She nodded, understanding that this was all he could do for her. As she moved toward the door, James called her name softly. "Margaret." She turned back to him, seeing in his eyes the same boy she had once known, before duty and responsibility had hardened him into the man he had become. "If circumstances were different," he began, then stopped himself. "Take care of yourself." Margaret left the castle that day knowing she would likely never see James Whitmore again. But his unexpected mercy had given her something she hadn't had in days' time. Time to think, time to plan, and time to find another way to save her brother. As her carriage rolled away from Windsor Castle, Margaret stared out at the countryside rushing past and made a vow. She would not let Thomas die. There had to be another way, and she would find it, even if it meant challenging the king himself. The game was far from over. Margaret spent the 3-hour carriage ride home consumed by a single thought. There had to be another way to save Thomas. The memory of James's unexpected mercy gave her hope, but it also reminded her that even those with power were bound by rules they couldn't break. If she was going to save her brother, she would have to think beyond conventional means. Ashford Manor greeted her with its familiar air of faded grandeur. The ivy-covered walls and crooked shutters spoke of better days long past, but it was still home. Sarah, their elderly housekeeper, met her at the door with worried eyes. "How did it go, my lady?" Sarah asked, though Margaret's expression already provided the answer. "Not well," Margaret admitted, handing over her riding gloves. "Is Eleanor here?" "In the library with the children. They've been asking about their father constantly." Margaret found her sister-in-law exactly where Sarah had said, reading to 6-year-old Emma and 4-year-old William. Eleanor looked up as Margaret entered, her face pale and drawn from days of crying and worry. "Margaret," Eleanor whispered, setting the book aside, "please tell me you have good news." The children ran to Margaret, wrapping their small arms around her skirts. She knelt down to embrace them, fighting back tears as she thought about them growing up without their father. "Aunt Maggie," Emma said in her serious little voice. "When is Papa coming home?" Margaret's heart broke a little more. "Soon, sweetheart. I'm working very hard to bring him home soon." Eleanor sent the children to play in the garden under Sarah's watchful eye, then turned to Margaret with desperate eyes. "What did Captain Whitmore say?" Margaret told her everything, from James's initial refusal to help to his unexpected protection after her outburst. Eleanor listened in stunned silence, her hand pressed to her mouth. "You attacked a royal guard?" Eleanor gasped. "Margaret, you could have been killed." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "But James protected me. He dismissed his own men's testimony to keep me safe." Eleanor began pacing the small library, her mind working furiously. If Captain Whitmore couldn't help, then who can? Surely someone has influence with the king. Margaret had been thinking the same thing. King George was known to be a reasonable man, but he was also firm in his belief that justice must be swift and decisive. Thomas's crime was clear, and the evidence overwhelming. Appeals for mercy rarely succeeded, especially when they came from families with no political influence. "There might be someone," Margaret said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "Lord Blackwood." Eleanor stopped pacing. "The king's advisor?" "Margaret, he's notorious for his cruelty. They say he's the one who convinced the king to increase penalties for crimes against the crown." "Exactly," Margaret said, standing up and moving to the window. "If anyone has the king's ear, it's Blackwood. And if I could convince him to speak for Thomas, how would you even get an audience with him? And what could you possibly offer that would interest a man like that?" Margaret stared out at the overgrown gardens, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Lord Blackwood was indeed a formidable man, known throughout the kingdom for his intelligence, his ruthlessness, and his rumored fascination with beautiful women. Several noble ladies had tried to catch his attention over the years, but he remained unmarried and seemingly unattached to anyone. "I could offer myself," Margaret said quietly. Eleanor went very still. "What do you mean?" Margaret turned from the window, her face set with grim determination. "Lord Blackwood is unmarried and looking for a wife. Everyone knows it, though he's been selective about his choice. If I could convince him that I would make a suitable match—" "Margaret, no." Eleanor's voice was sharp with horror. "You can't sacrifice yourself like that. Thomas would never forgive you." "Thomas will be dead if I don't try," Margaret replied bluntly. "At least this way, one of us survives." Eleanor sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "There has to be another way. If there is, I can't see it," Margaret said, sitting down beside her sister-in-law. "We have no money, no influence, no connections except for James, and he's already done all he can. Lord Blackwood is our last hope." They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Eleanor looked up with tears in her eyes. "If you do this," she said slowly, "it has to be believable. Blackwood is too intelligent to be fooled by a desperate woman throwing herself at him. You would need a proper introduction, a reason for him to notice you that doesn't seem connected to Thomas's situation." Margaret nodded. Eleanor was right. Approaching Blackwood directly would only make him suspicious. She needed a more subtle approach. "Lady Pemberton," Margaret said suddenly. "She's hosting her annual autumn ball next week. Half the nobility will be there, including Blackwood. If I could get an invitation." Eleanor's eyes brightened slightly. "Lady Pemberton was a friend of your mother's. She might be willing to help, especially if she doesn't know the full extent of your family's troubles." Margaret felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in days. Lady Pemberton was a gossipy but kind-hearted woman who loved playing matchmaker among the younger nobility. If Margaret could convince her that she was simply a young woman looking for a suitable husband, Lady Pemberton would be delighted to introduce her to eligible men, including Lord Blackwood. "I'll need a new dress," Margaret said, her mind racing ahead to the practical details. "Something that will catch his attention without being too obvious." "We could alter Mother's blue silk gown," Eleanor suggested, "the one from the trunk in the attic. It's old-fashioned, But the fabric is exquisite. Margaret nodded, grateful for Eleanor's quick thinking. They would need to work fast. The ball was only 5 days away, and there would be much to prepare. That evening, Margaret sat down to write 2 letters. The first was to Lady Pemberton, carefully worded to suggest that Margaret was ready to rejoin society after a period of mourning for her parents. She made no mention of Thomas or their financial troubles, instead focusing on her desire to reconnect with old friends and perhaps find a suitable marriage partner. The second letter was more difficult to write. It was addressed to James Whitmore, and in it, Margaret thanked him for his kindness and protection. She didn't mention her plan to pursue Lord Blackwood. James would try to stop her if he knew, and she couldn't afford to have her only ally working against her. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Eleanor proved to be a talented seamstress, transforming their mother's old gown into something that was both fashionable and flattering. The midnight blue silk brought out the green in Margaret's eyes and complemented her auburn hair perfectly. With the addition of some carefully placed lace and a few strategic alterations, the dress looked like it had come from the finest dressmaker in London. Margaret also spent hours practicing her deportment and conversation skills. She would need to be charming without appearing desperate, intelligent without seeming threatening, and beautiful without looking artificial. It was a delicate balance, and one wrong step could ruin everything. Lady Pemberton's response arrived on the 4th day, written in her characteristic flowing script. She was delighted to hear from Margaret and would be thrilled to welcome her to the autumn ball. The older woman even mentioned that several eligible gentlemen would be attending, including some of the most influential men in the kingdom. Margaret smiled as she read the letter. Lady Pemberton had taken the bait perfectly. On the evening of the ball, Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The transformation was remarkable. She looked every inch the sophisticated lady of the court, someone worthy of a powerful man's attention. Eleanor had styled her hair in an elegant updo, leaving a few curls to frame her face, and a touch of rouge on her lips completed the picture. "You look beautiful," Eleanor said softly, standing behind her. "But Margaret, please be careful. Lord Blackwood is not a man to be trifled with. If he discovers your true motives—" "He won't," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "I'll make him believe that I'm genuinely interested in him, not just using him to save Thomas." Eleanor handed her a small velvet pouch containing the last of their mother's jewelry, a pair of pearl earrings and a matching necklace. These will complete the look. As Margaret fastened the earrings, she thought about what lay ahead. In a few hours, she would be in the same room as Lord Blackwood, trying to catch the attention of one of the most powerful men in England. Her brother's life depended on her success. The carriage ride to Lady Pemberton's estate seemed both eternal and far too short. Margaret's heart pounded as they approached the grand mansion, ablaze with lights and already filled with the cream of society. This was her one chance to save Thomas, and she couldn't afford to fail. As she stepped down from the carriage and walked toward the entrance, Margaret whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Tonight, she would either secure her brother's freedom or seal both their fates. The game had begun in earnest. Lady Pemberton's ballroom glittered like a jewel box, crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across walls, lined with silk and gold. The cream of English nobility filled the space, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of privilege and power. Margaret entered the grand room with her head held high, every inch the confident lady of society, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Lady Pemberton swept toward her immediately, resplendent in purple satin and diamond jewelry that could have fed a village for a year. "My dear Margaret," she exclaimed, taking both of Margaret's hands in hers. "You look absolutely radiant. The blue brings out your eyes magnificently." "Thank you for inviting me, Lady Pemberton," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "It's wonderful to be back in society." "Nonsense, child. Your parents would have wanted you to enjoy yourself. Now come. There are several people I simply must introduce you to." As Lady Pemberton led her through the crowd, Margaret's eyes searched the room for Lord Blackwood. She spotted him near the far end of the ballroom, surrounded by a small group of influential men, deep in what appeared to be a political discussion. Even from across the room, his presence was commanding, tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. "Ah, there's Lord Ashworth," Lady Pemberton said, steering Margaret toward a different group entirely, a widower with a substantial estate in Yorkshire. Quite handsome, don't you think? Margaret allowed herself to be introduced to Lord Ashworth and several other gentlemen, playing the part of an eligible young lady looking for a suitable match. But her attention kept drifting toward Lord Blackwood, waiting for the right moment to engineer an introduction. That moment came an hour later, when the musicians struck up a waltz and couples began moving onto the dance floor. Margaret had just finished dancing with a pleasant but boring baron, when she found herself standing near the refreshment table, accepting a glass of champagne from a footman. "Lady Margaret Ashford, is it not?" The voice was deep, cultured, and carried just a hint of amusement. Margaret turned to find Lord Blackwood standing beside her, his dark eyes studying her with undisguised interest. "Lord Blackwood," she said with a curtsy, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm honored that you know my name. Your reputation for beauty precedes you," he replied smoothly. "Though I must say, the reports were inadequate." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "You flatter me, my lord." "I never flatter," Blackwood said, moving closer. "I simply state facts. Would you honor me with the next dance?" This was exactly what Margaret had hoped for. Yet now that the moment was here, she felt a chill of fear. Lord Blackwood's reputation for ruthlessness was well earned, and she could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes that had made him the king's most trusted adviser. "I would be delighted," she said, placing her hand on his offered arm. As they moved onto the dance floor, Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances from other guests. Lord Blackwood rarely danced at social functions, preferring to conduct business even at balls. His choice to dance with her would be noted and discussed for weeks to come. "You dance beautifully," Blackwood said as he led her through the intricate steps of the waltz. "Tell me, Lady Margaret, what brings you back to society? I heard you had withdrawn after your parents' passing." Margaret had rehearsed her response to this question, but being this close to Blackwood, close enough to see the calculating look in his eyes, made her suddenly nervous. "Grief has a way of isolating us," she said carefully. "But I realize that hiding away serves no purpose. Life must be lived." "Wise words," Blackwood said, spinning her gracefully. "And are you looking to live that life with a suitable husband?" The directness of his question caught Margaret off guard, but she recovered quickly. "I believe a woman's happiness is best secured through a proper marriage. Yes, indeed." Blackwood's smile was enigmatic. "And what qualities would you seek in such a husband?" Margaret felt as though she was walking through a minefield. Every answer could either advance her cause or destroy it completely. "Intelligence," she said finally. "Power, the ability to protect and provide for his family. Admirable qualities," Blackwood agreed. "Though I notice you didn't mention love. Love is a luxury," Margaret replied, the words coming from her heart, despite her careful planning. "Security and protection are necessities." Something shifted in Blackwood's expression, a flicker of genuine interest replacing the polite social mask. "You speak like a woman who has learned hard lessons." The dance ended, but instead of escorting her back to the side of the ballroom, Blackwood offered her his arm. "Would you care to take some air on the terrace? It's quite warm in here." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was her opportunity to speak with him privately, to begin the delicate process of winning his favor. "That sounds lovely." The terrace overlooked Lady Pemberton's extensive gardens, now silvered by moonlight. The autumn air was crisp and clean, a welcome relief from the stuffy ballroom. Blackwood led her to a quiet corner, away from the other couples who had also sought fresh air. "You intrigue me, Lady Margaret," he said without preamble. "Most young women your age speak of romance and poetry. You speak of necessity and protection. It suggests experience beyond your years." Margaret knew this was the crucial moment. She could continue with her carefully planned performance, or she could take a risk and speak more honestly. Something in Blackwood's tone suggested he might respect honesty more than artifice. "Perhaps because I've seen what happens when protection fails," she said quietly. "Ah." Blackwood leaned against the stone balustrade, studying her in the moonlight. "Your family's financial difficulties, you mean?" Margaret's blood ran cold. If Blackwood knew about their money troubles, did he also know about Thomas? Was her carefully constructed plan already falling apart? "I see my reputation for gathering information is well-founded," Blackwood continued, noting her expression. "Yes, I know about the debts, the sale of property. I also know about your brother." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. "My lord, Please. Blackwood held up a hand. No deception between us. I know Thomas Ashford sits in prison awaiting trial for debt to the Crown. I also know you visited Captain Whitmore recently, presumably seeking his help. Margaret's mind raced. If Blackwood knew everything, then her presence here tonight could be seen as nothing more than a desperate attempt to manipulate him. She had failed before she'd even begun. I suppose you think me quite foolish, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. On the contrary, Blackwood replied, his tone surprisingly gentle. I think you quite remarkable. To come here tonight, knowing you would have to deceive and charm your way into my good graces, for your brother's sake, it shows tremendous courage. Margaret stared at him in confusion. Then why did you ask me to dance? Why bring me out here? Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. Because, he said finally, I wanted to see if you would go through with it. I wanted to see what kind of woman would sacrifice herself for her family. And what did you conclude? That you are exactly the kind of woman I've been looking for. Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. I don't understand. Blackwood turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I am 43 years old, Lady Margaret. I have spent my life accumulating power and influence, but I have no heir, no one to leave my legacy to. I need a wife, but not some simpering girl who wants to be pampered and protected. I need a woman who understands sacrifice, who knows the value of hard choices. You're saying? Margaret's voice trailed off, hardly daring to hope. I'm saying that your desperation may have led you to exactly what you were seeking, though perhaps not in the way you expected. Blackwood moved closer to her. I will speak to the king about your brother. His debt will be forgiven, and he will be released. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. In exchange for what? For you becoming my wife. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. This was what Margaret had hoped to achieve, but hearing it stated so baldly made the reality sink in. She would be bound to this man, powerful though he was, for the rest of her life. I need time to consider, she said carefully. Of course. Blackwood's smile was understanding. Though I should tell you that time is not a luxury your brother possesses. His trial is scheduled for tomorrow. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Tomorrow, Thomas would face the king's justice. Unless she agreed to Blackwood's proposal tonight, her brother would die. If I agree, she said slowly, what kind of marriage would it be? What would you expect from me? Honesty, Blackwood replied immediately. Loyalty, intelligence, the ability to be a true partner, not merely an ornament. I have no desire for a wife who cowers in my shadow. Margaret looked at him standing there in the moonlight, this powerful man who held her brother's life in his hands. He was not unattractive, and his intelligence was undeniable. More importantly, he seemed to respect her courage rather than see it as a threat. And children? She asked. I would hope for them, yes. An heir is necessary for any man in my position. Margaret nodded slowly. It was not the worst fate she could imagine. In fact, it was far better than she had dared to hope. To save Thomas and secure her own future as the wife of one of the most powerful men in England, it was more than she had dreamed possible. I accept, she said quietly. Blackwood's smile was genuine this time, transforming his stern features. Excellent. I will visit the king first thing in the morning. Your brother will be free by noon. Just like that? Margaret asked, hardly able to believe it was so simple. Just like that, Blackwood confirmed. The advantages of being indispensable to the crown. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the agreement they had just made. Finally, Blackwood offered her his arm. Shall we return to the ballroom? I believe Lady Pemberton will be quite pleased with the success of her matchmaking, even if she doesn't realize her role in it. As they walked back toward the lights and music, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The desperate plan that had brought her here tonight had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes. Thomas would live, her family would be secure, and she would become Lady Blackwood, one of the most powerful women in England. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was a good life, and perhaps, in time, it might even become a happy one. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the chapel at Blackwood's estate, wearing an ivory silk gown that cost more than her family's manor was worth. As she spoke her vows to the man who had saved her brother's life, she thought about that desperate night when she had attacked James Whitmore in his office. Her act of desperation had led her here, to this moment, to this new beginning. Sometimes, Margaret reflected as Blackwood slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, the most reckless acts led to the most unexpected gifts, and sometimes, what appeared to be surrender was actually the greatest victory of all.